examples of student engagement across university campuses. As you know, everyone knows, there was a wave of student encampments calling for university diversity. The United States, which historically has been a bastion of support for Israel, but I think what's also really important and what's often missing from the story, these endowments are basically invested at the sole discretion of university boards of trustees, which are overwhelmingly composed of elite financiers and other corporate leadership. So universities are governed in the US are governed profoundly undemocratically. But the important thing to note is that this is actually a huge pot of money that and this money is invested in all sorts of places, right? And a lot of those places are either directly or indirectly tied to the genocide in Gaza. So we know, and student groups across the country have done this research. They're able to tell you, our university holds investments in these companies. More democratic or a different kind of decision-making around these resources that are actually allocated to further education or whatever the university's mission is, and not genocide and warmongering.
Okay. Which kind of
hiring for a lot of reasons, including the historical, the way that it basically what sorts of charges they want to press and what they want to pursue. And so one of the things we saw, which is interesting in New York, is the students at Columbia, because Columbia is a private university, because it's a high visibility university, often those students actually ended up getting lesser charges than their peers at public institutions in New York City, who would get heavier charges, and then have to fight those. Not to let the Biden administration off, but I think it was a different kind of pressure now we see a very different terrain politically today.
I have a question for you. How do student groups frame their critique of U.S. foreign policy in relation to settler colonialism, militarism, and imperialism?
I want to answer that question. Can I add something about the last one?
Yes, of course.
The other thing to note about the last one is that, understandably, people outside the U.S. look at the U.S. and they think of the federal government. But actually, also a lot of the pressure on universities was also coming from state governments, and in some cases, local governments. So in Chicago, the pressure, more legislative levers to threaten, in part universities, but also often association, like professor associations and things like that. So for example, one of the big associations of professors was the membership of the association was calling for BDS, was calling to boycott Israeli institutions. And is this question of how do we give people the correct information, and how do we make sure people have access to reliable information, not just on Palestine, but also on a broad host of issues that are deeply interconnected, right? Yeah. And so this was the encampment. What did we do all day? We didn't just sit there all day. Every day, there were, I was part of the program team. We had a series of workshops with experts, with local community activists, with activists from all over the place. And part of that exercise was for people to be able to get a better understanding of what was going on. We also had a library as part of the encampment with books, various books that people could sort of check out and read. And this is part of why it's so ridiculous, actually, that universities were saying that we were disrupting education or whatever, disrupting the business of the university. It's because actually, the encampments were deeply educational spaces. We were profoundly interested in learning from each other, and learning from local experts and activists, and some of the people who would do the talks were professors also, right? So these are different kinds of learning, and it's in part because the media landscape in the United States is a really difficult landscape, to say the least. One that is invested in the genocide in its own ways, and so I think the stranglehold of the mainstream media on the narrative has broken, and I think that's why I think the reason that the targeting has been so aggressive is because the narrative has changed. It's because they're losing, that, and that's why they're so scared.
America is supporting, even with weapons and money, a lot of money, Israel. So if people understand that this is a genocide, this is a big problem for America.
Yeah, no, and I think I think what's interesting too about this is that, you know, I think the data tells us that the majority of Americans are not interested in continuing to send weapons for a genocide, right? We know this. And I think what Palestine highlights, again, which we've known for the last several years, but it highlights it really very clearly, is the extent to which, like, the American government, like, there is a problem in the United States, which is that, like, the government is not responsive, actually, to what people want. The government is responsive to the interests of big money. Yeah. And these private interests that basically determine, you know, whatever, our foreign policy and all sorts of other policies. And I think that Palestine, for a lot of people, the genocide in Gaza is bringing these contradictions to light so clearly. Like, it's laying these issues out, like, so obviously. In ways that like, it was less clear with other issues, but in this situation, it's just like, it's so clear to people. And I know, like, I've talked to a lot of people who would come by the encampment or who, whatever, like my classmates, people I know, and you know, there are some people who, like, come in and they know their politics and they're like, all of this is bad and settler colonialism is bad and whatever. There are other people who come in and they're like, listen, I don't know that much, but I know what's going on is wrong. Right? And I think this is like the genocide has made so clear and like really, really sharpened these distinctions for people in a way that, like, is very difficult to ignore. And we saw this with the results of the presidential election, of course, and, you know, continuing.
We saw even in the demonstrations some anti-Zionist Jews people were in the demonstrations. Are American people understanding, for example, that there is a difference between anti-Semitism, Zionism, or just fighting for human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's increasingly, like, a distinction people have been able to make. I also think it's to some extent a big generational distinction. I mean, you see this, like, the encampment and the Palestine movement in general has a lot of Jews. There are a lot of Jews who participate. And I think this is not my story to tell, but I think it's very clear that there is, like, a profound generational divide in the Jewish American community. I know Jewish American friends of mine who, like, weren't speaking to their parents for a long time over this. Like, because they hold such different views, and I think that's, you know, like, they're working that out, and that's a conversation for the Jewish community to have, certainly. But I think there is, I think that reflects first, again, the interfaith character of the movement. You know, every day at the encampment we would have Maghrib, we would have the Muslim Maghrib prayers, and then we would have the Jewish Ma'ariv prayers. Every day. And, you know, we continue to do interfaith things at our encampment, and this is the case across the board. But I think, I mean, certainly Jewish people, many Jewish people, especially, like, many younger Jewish, bought the, like, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism thing, who now are, like, there are children dying, and there are people who are mad about that. This is not just anti-Semitism. That's not what it is. So there are a lot of different factors that I think complicate this picture for folks. But we see, I mean, very clearly in the data in the U.S. That, you know, the public opinion has shifted wildly on this, despite the best efforts. And the most recent example of this is actually New York City. The mayoral election, or the Democratic primary in New York City, where, you know, the primary attack on on Zohran Mamdani, who ended up winning, like, was the Palestine thing. And New York City is, like, the city with the largest number of Jews outside of occupied Palestine, and, you know, like, it just didn't work. Like, it just didn't work. Like, the attack just didn't work, and it's because there's this shift in understanding in the U.S. where people are very clearly able to recognize when something is anti-Semitism and when something is actually just, like, legitimate criticism of a genocidal apartheid state.
Okay. How do you see U.S. students' protests linking with global movements for Palestinian liberation in America and in the world?
So I think there's a couple of different angles to this. Like one side of it is a strategy side, right? And one side of it is a learning side. I think in general,